At this point in High Roads, we have had a pattern firmly established. Author Scott Lobdell, penciler Leinil Yu, and colorist Edgar Tadeo have set up a back and forth pattern of one issue opening in color and the next issue opening in a black and white flashback, or at least an extremely washed out color. Yeah, I misspoke last episode when I said that Sir Arthur's flashback in issue 2 wasn't in color. It is. It was just so hard for me to notice that I didn't notice it until I was actually editing the episode for that video. The coloring in it is just so subtle that I didn't even remember the coloring being there. But it is, so that's my bad, everybody. Last issue saw our established characters of Sergeant Nicholas Highroads, Sir Arthur Bombridge III, and Sloane Appleby attempt to make their way to Germany in order to steal the Morpheus necklace from the Nazis. This trip was cut short by Nazi forces, which they did defeat, but it forced them to re-examine exactly what they were after. Studying the paperwork that Sloane stole didn't reveal what the necklace was, or why Hitler was so concerned with silencing anyone who knew about it, but it did reveal the necklace's location. At the Arctic Circle. Our cast was going to need a ride, and so they were introduced to Oki, a former kamikaze pilot who went rogue. We actually saw Oki abandon his mission in that flashback sequence, which was in black and white, and I double-checked. The only colors present was the red of Oki's Rising Sun headband, so there. That said, issue 5 should open up with an in-color flashback, and get damn! Those are some huge tracts of land. Wow! Issue 5 of High Roads opens up in Wallow Point, Tennessee, the childhood home of Nick Highroad. Nick is working inside the barn of his family's farm, and his childhood friend, Christy Jean, is there with him. Christy is a buxom blonde bombshell of a woman, wearing some Daisy Duke-style cutoffs, a unbuttoned blue plaid top, and a cowboy hat. She lounges on a pile of hay while Nick works with a pitchfork nearby, complaining about his lack of hospitality. Why, she only stopped by because it's so hot, and he's such a hard worker. She figured that she could bring him some lemonade and quench his thirst. And Nick is happy to see her, sure, but, it ain't right for the two of them to be alone out here. He grabs his shirt from a nearby nail and pulls it on. Christy eyes his flat stomach as he lifts his arms to do so. Being alone with Nicky is what she was hoping for. She even waited until she saw his parents leave to visit. She picks up a glass of lemonade and offers it to him, drawing his and our eyes level with her bountiful goods. Now drink up. Nick does and thanks her for the drink, and Christy says that they grew up together. They're pretty much best friends, right? Nick says sure, he doesn't know anyone better than he knows her. Christy was thinking about that. And now, her best friend is going off to war, bravely risking his life to defend his country, his family, her. And it got her thinking, what could she do for her country? And Christy Jean thinks that, well, some servicemen would have to appreciate making her from a girl into a woman, but she wants it to be someone that she knows, someone who loves her. She wants it to be Nick. And Nick does a spit take, spraying lemonade down his shirt and on Christy's face. Thankfully, Christy thinks that it is funny. As they clean up, Nick says that he's real honored by that, but that's the kind of thing that you should do after you get married, not before. The whole world is at war, Christy counters. What if I don't live to see tomorrow? What if neither of us do? As Nick is wiping off the lemonade, Christy takes his hand and places it on her chest. I don't want to die before I know what it means to make love. Do you? The two of them suddenly start kissing, pulling at each other's clothes. They fall back into the pile of hay with Christy on top. She just barely stops and looks Nicky in the eyes. Wait, you do love me, don't you? She asks. Nick hesitates, barely. His expression is one of confusion, amazement, but he does say, yeah, sure, I love you. Christy leans over and kisses him, her eyes closed, savoring this moment. Nick's eyes, however, are wide open. My name is Ben, and this is Comic Book Breakdown, episode 30.3 of High Roads, The End of the Road. Ooh, that got a little spicy. Obviously, we have now met Krista Jean, and I can understand why she was still on Nick's mind, even when he was across the world in France fighting Nazi ninjas on top of a train. She is very attractive, and she is very forward, and unfortunately, we don't really know anything else about her. We only have this one scene to judge her character on, and it is a pretty one-note scene. For Nick, though, this scene is incredibly subtle, and he is, after all, our main lead character. Author Scott Lobdell is demonstrating that Nick isn't a perfect person. This moment, this scene, is his character flaw. When Christy Jean starts throwing herself at him, he goes right along with it, but he honestly doesn't seem to be in love with her. He probably does love her. He does say that they've known each other pretty much all of their lives. But maybe those feelings have been more like the love for a family member, or honestly, shockingly, maybe he just loved her as a good friend. Maybe Nick never saw Krista Jean as a romantic partner at all. But once she got his engine going, he played along. Because it felt good, you know? And maybe part of it is what she said. He was going off to war. He might die in that conflict. What's the harm in having one last bit of fun before leaving, even if it isn't exactly morally, religiously right? And Nick does point out that you shouldn't make love before being married, and he has clearly been shown to be a bit of a goody two-shoes character. Strangely, Nick never feels religious. He just feels like a good guy. I mean, he honestly just feels naive. He feels innocent. He feels like he might have been raised in a religious household without necessarily believing in the religion, to me, but he was shown wearing a cross at the end of issue 3, so maybe Nick is more religious than I thought, and it just hasn't come up yet because that's not what the story's about. Otherwise, this is our final flashback scene in High Roads, and for the most part, I think it does a good job of examining. I suppose it doesn't really examine. I think it more demonstrates the type of person that Nick is. And he's a horny bastard. In the war-torn landscape of Paris, Oki points out his plane to our cast, and they are all less than impressed by it. Nick does his best to be complimentary, as is his way, but Sloane cannot believe it. She isn't getting on that. And while Sir Arthur doesn't say anything, he is clearly unhappy. Just as a point of order, author Lobdell does write Oki's dialogue as fairly stilted. The man is clearly fluent in English, meaning that he understands it when it is spoken to him, but he is not nearly as proficient in speaking it. He says that they wanted to travel quickly and in secret. Are they in or are they out? They need to decide. The camera spins around, finally giving us a good look at Commander Key's plane, the Purring Sun. It clearly has some dings. It's got some patched bullet holes. It's missing a couple small pieces of the engine housings. But I mean, it's a free plane ride. What are you going to do in World War II? Under his breath, Sir Arthur curses, "By the 3 bloody nails and the crown of thorns," referencing the nails that held Jesus upon the cross and the crown of thorns placed on his head. But Sloane is the one who reminds them that Dolphy knows that they know that he doesn't want them to know about the Morpheus necklace. Basically, they're wasting time. Sir Arthur finally summons his courage. "You know what, Sloane, you're right. Commander Key will take it. Fire it up. Let's go." While Key goes to do whatever it is that one does to start a plane, Nick actually argues against this course of action. Stealing the necklace isn't worth the risk that riding that plane is, he says. Sloane agrees. There's really no point in stealing the necklace if they're not alive to spend the necklace. Sir Arthur smiles. He asks if either of them have seen the Cowboy Archie movies. And Nick is flabbergasted by this information. Wait a minute, you're Cowboy Artie? Sloane is not impressed. Yeah, so what? The point, my dear, Sir Arthur says, is that I have been very, very rich. And I have been very, very poor. Don't let anyone tell you that money can't buy happiness. This might be my last chance to have it all back, and I intend to take it, no matter the risk. What about Sloane? She was Hitler's American mistress. What kind of life can she expect back in the States? That's not something that anyone is going to like. And what about Nick? They don't do this, and he goes home and what? Works the farm alongside his gray-haired mother? A woman whose life he could have made easier if only he'd had the courage to steal something from a monster who has only made the world a worse place. And what about our pilot? But before Sir Arthur can comment on him, Oki's katana is resting right before his throat. Sir Arthur stops talking. Oki sheathes his blade. Talk more, cost more. You coming? Decide. We then get a single-page check-in with, with the big man himself, Hitler. It's set at a bunker somewhere in the dark heart of Germany, and a commander praises Hitler's plans for the final solution. And Hitler's like, yeah, I'm dope, I'm going to rule the world. But honestly, screw that guy. Can we take a look at that last scene for a second? Because for the first time in all of High Roads, that scene didn't work for me. I do like the cast's basic fear of flying in the purring sun. Remember, while humans had the ability to fly for approximately 40 years at this point in world history, it still wasn't exactly a commonplace piece of technology. Planes would have mostly been used as tools of war, built for speed, stealth, or distance as a transportation, not necessarily for comfortability. Someone like Nick would maybe have seen like a barnstormer or an aerial stunt show back in the States growing up, but mass air travel like we're familiar with commercial planes was not available yet. Even in his trip over to Europe, Nick very likely would have crossed the Atlantic on a boat. And even if he had been flown over, that would have been on a much larger troop carrier, which again, wouldn't have been comfortable and could honestly have instilled more fear of flying into him than put him at ease. Sir Arthur's one-time riches may have allowed him to travel by way of personal plane, but we have no evidence of that at this point. And Sloane was married to a member of the RAF, or England's Royal Air Forces. So those two may have had some familiarity with flying, but again, it wouldn't have been something that they did all of the time, and so they're probably not really comfortable with the idea of flying in a plane. And then you look at the Purring Sun, and it's not exactly in mint condition. Like, if the Purring Sun was a comic book, I'm not paying more than $1 for it. That is not really good. That's not good condition. That's okay at best. And again, is that something you're willing to risk your life on, especially for a dude that you've never met before? I also like Sir Arthur's little motivating speech to get all of them moving. As far as manipulating the cast into getting the necklace, I mean, he does a really solid job. He explains his own personal reasons for wanting it first, showing why he is in this, and also showing that it's not for some altruistic reason to the rest of the cast. He isn't trying to be a hero here. He isn't trying to convince them that they're doing this for the betterment of mankind. Sir Arthur is a greedy Subanovich, and he wants to get paid. Then he hits the other two in their pride. Sloane is very likely to get no personal sympathy as Hitler's former mistress when she returns to life in America. The lifestyle that she got used to is gone, unless she's in and unless they get the necklace. And on the other hand, Nick is an altruistic person. He wants to do the right thing. So Sir Arthur actually manufactures a more personal reason for him. Nick hasn't said anything about his family back home. He hasn't said what life on the farm is like, whether it's hard or easy. Does his family employ other employees or anything like that? Sir Arthur says, "You're going to go back home and work your poor gray-haired mother to death?" We have no reason to think that that's the situation. But he is playing on Nick's love for his mother by saying, "Don't you want to take care of your mom? This money will let you do that." What I don't like is how back and forth our cast is regarding this flight. Each one of them protests it, and then each one of them argues for it. And maybe author Scott Lobdell was demonstrating that they're all having second thoughts now that they're looking at the purring sun. Maybe they're not really trying to talk each other into this, rather, they're trying to talk themselves into it. Each person sees it and they go, "There's no way I'm flying in that plane." But then they immediately follow it up with a, "But if we don't fly in that plane, we're not going to get the necklace." But this creates an incredibly awkward read, which is something that I only really picked up on because I was trying to figure out a good way to put their dialogue into the script and not have it feel repetitive. Because it is. Each character literally goes, "I'm not flying on that, but I have to fly on that." So I don't think they're having a conversation. I think they're talking themselves into it. It honestly kind of feels like a waste of page space to me. Ultimately, we'll see how this fits into the overall story soon. We're actually almost done with the comic, but this scene is probably the single weakest scene that I have seen in High Roads for me so far. How many times can I say scene in a sentence? At least 3, it looks like. And to be fair, that is like one bad scene in 5 issues up to this point, which isn't really a bad ratio at all. This is still overall really well written and really well done. This one is just kind of sticking in my craw a little bit. When we catch back up with our cast, the purring sun is flying north, sputtering and coughing as it goes. Nick and Sloane are having a conversation, while Sir Arthur moves into the co-pilot seat next to Oki. Sloane is feeling nervous about their situation, for the most part. She's realized that if she hadn't slept with Hitler, if she hadn't stolen those papers from him, then none of them would be flying in this death trap of a plane right about now. The people at Madame Eugenia and the other passengers on that train that got blown up would still be alive. In a very real way, this is all Sloane's fault. Nick says that he doesn't know how a monster like Hitler thinks, but he knows in his heart that this is about something more than a necklace. It's not her fault. Sloane rests her head against his shoulder. "The world needs more men like you," she sighs. There is a brief pause as Nick lets that sink in, and then he thanks her. But he does say that he's done things he ain't proud of. He reckons that everyone has. Which alludes to our opening scene for this issue. That's the kind of writing I show up for a Scott Lobdell comic. Last scene, terrible. Tying our opening scene in this scene, fantastic. Sir Arthur, meanwhile, has sat down next to Oki and he's begun badgering him with questions. How do you know what course we're on? What's our petrol look like? How do you... And Oki suddenly just lets go of the stick and crosses his arms. As the plane starts to drop, Sir Arthur panics. "Good God, son, what are you doing?" "Cannot listen and fly," Oki says, pouting. "You talk, Oki listen." "I'll shut up, lad," Sir Arthur replies. "Just grab the wheel." He does, and the group keeps on flying. Now chagrined, Sir Arthur turns his attention to their map, and after a time, it looks like they should be getting close. But according to the map, they should be in the middle of nowhere. Oki's eyes widen. Maybe not so much anymore. Looking down below them, a massive metal... What is this? It's a structure? Is it a battleship? A landscape? An armored city? It is actually a massive man-made island with a massive city built at the heart of it. We can see apartment buildings all crammed together. Surrounding that city center is an enormous metal wall, protection from the Allied forces that are bombarding Nazis. Turrets and cannons stick out all along the edges, poking out at uneven intervals. A dozen dirigibles fly around the island. Our cast is actually flying over one of them now. We can see the purring sun shadow on its skin. Well, cheese and crackers. That ain't supposed to be there, Nick whispers. Something that evil shouldn't be anywhere. Sir Arthur stares down. They may be looking at the end of civilization as they know it. So, what do they do now? Sloane asks. That is not what any of them were expecting to find. Oki says that they have to land. The other three protest this politely, but at this point it isn't up to Oki. A flight of Nazi planes have surrounded them. They've got an armed escort. They are going wherever they want them to go now. They fly over the man-made metal island and begin to approach the ice cathedral that we saw Nick scaling back in issue 1, carved out of the ice of the Arctic Circle. After being forced to land, the 4 oddball characters are escorted inside by a group of armed and armored guards. Oki, who is walking next to Sir Arthur, mutters that he should kill them all, and the shorter man sneers. How exactly does he propose to do that? Oki points out that it's too cold up here for machine guns to work properly, but he could warm them up with hot blood freed by his blade. Sir Arthur nods in appreciation, filing that information away. As they approach the massive door, flanked by icy figures of knights, Sloane is blown away. She's got Nick's jacket wrapped tightly around her chest, but she is still wearing a skirt. It is a long, knee-length skirt, but it is still a skirt. And she knew that Dolphy was fascinated by the North Pole, but this is ridiculous. There are enough explosives here to start a new world, one of the guards brags, but he is suddenly punched in the gut by another guard, who orders him to be quiet! Our 4 members of the cast are led inside, and then they're left alone. Why they are left alone doesn't even cross Nick's mind. He's actually just more surprised at how warm it is inside. Sloane is the one who noticed that they've been left alone, and Sir Arthur is eager to take advantage of their abandonment. Let's get out of here and find Morpheus' necklace, he urges. You people are priceless, a woman says. Our heroes turn and see a busty French woman in a black leather uniform. Her black hair is undone, cascading around her face in curls. This is Madame Blanche Noire, formerly of the French Resistance. As a prisoner of war, she saw that their side was not the winning side, so she defected. And here she stands before them. Bristling, Sir Arthur asks her, how could she be so sure who was going to win? And she answers confidently, for the same reasons that I am certain you 4 are the 4 biggest losers in the world. You came all this way to steal Morpheus' necklace? You are standing in it. Oh, oui, there was a piece of jewelry with that name, but the Führer saw that he needed a final solution, as the possibility of defeat crawled ever closer. He has positioned 4 atomic bombs here at the crest of the world. When they explode, they will melt the ice caps and flood the world. Only those who have sworn allegiance to him will survive on his man-made Aryan nation, which our cast saw flying in. Sir Arthur's eyes narrow in suspicion and disappointment. There's no necklace? Sloane looks disappointed. Is that how far Dolphy has fallen? To destroying the entire world? Oki comments that he isn't being paid enough for this. And Nick is just confused. Just to be clear, what is an atomic bomb? He asks. And Nick's joke is a nice light-hearted way to close out this issue, pivoting us away from the suddenly incredibly horrific situation that our casters find themselves in. Their personal dreams of wealth and opulence are no more, and instead, they find themselves in the unlucky position of being the only non-Nazis in the world to do something about the real necklace and the threat that it poses. They have no weapons, they've got no backup, and they've got little hope, but that doesn't mean that they're beaten at all. We have seen this cast improvise with the best of them over the course of our last 4 issues, and after all, this is heroic fiction. Our heroes are going to find a way. We hope. So the back half of this particular issue was largely character work with our cast. Once they got into the air, we saw Sloane and Nick bond a little bit more, and now that we've seen Nick's flashback with Christy Jean, we see why he hasn't been so quick to judge Sloane despite her own background. People do stupid things when they're in love, or at the very least, when they are caught up in a moment of lust. Nick knows that people make mistakes, and we've now seen his. Given how largely perfect Nick has been in the series up to this point, it is nice to see a flaw in his armor, even if it is a relatively small one, right? But his literal roll in the hay with Christy Jean clearly still bothers him, so it goes to show how important that moment is to Nick as a part of his life. Sir Arthur is largely comedic relief when he is paired with Oki, but I would argue that Oki does make a pretty strong impression here. This is the first real amount of time that we've got to spend with him, and overall, I do like him. He is willing to work with our cast, but he is also clearly keeping some emotional distance from them. I absolutely love when Sir Arthur begins to badger him and he just lets go of the plane. Like, I don't want to deal with your questions, I'm doing something. I've been there so many times in my life, not with flying a plane, but oh God, I know that feeling all too well. Despite his overall quiet, Oki does appear to be fierce and determined. He's one of the first of them to suggest that they fight at the Ice Cathedral, and he is the one who kept pressuring the cast to decide what they're going to do. Are you going to fly to the Arctic Circle or not? Let's go, let's go, let's go. And I like that drive in the character. Oki's desire to not die, which we've seen demonstrated, might not indicate that he has a weak will. In fact, it might just demonstrate a will that is so strong that he is willing to go against the entire culture of his homeland and society in order to find satisfaction. The reveal of Morpheus' necklace that we get here as well is cool as hell. But it's also one of those things that strains credulity. There is no way that the Nazis would have been able to smuggle that much iron and steel to the North Pole and gone unnoticed. Humanity has barely scratched the surface of making islands. Like now, in modern history, in 2023, we understand how to do it and we have found ways to build it. But during World War II, especially an island that is essentially made of nothing but metal, I honestly don't understand how that's possible. And if Hitler has access to atomic bombs, then why is he waiting to use them as part of this scheme instead of as part of the war effort? And like, don't get me wrong, as a comic book fan, this is a cool scheme. This is a great supervillain scheme. As far as supervillain plots go, I think that this is super fun, it's got great stakes, and of course, it's comic book big, right? It's not just, oh, I'm going to bomb a city and blow it up, and that's terrible and tragic in its own way, but I'm going to flood the world and then rule it from my little floating island. Ho, 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 ho. That's comic book level silly, and I love that degree of silliness. But up to this point, Highroads has been fairly realistic in how the cast behaves and the world that they're existing in, so it doesn't really feel like it meshes very well with the rest of the comic book, right? And obviously, Highroads has been pretty fast and loose with its overall tone. It has leaned into the comedy when appropriate. It's been silly when it's wanted to be. That's kind of the point of High Road. But still, it does feel a little bit jarring for me. It's just real world enough that you go, oh, okay, I could maybe see something like this eventually happening. But it's also wacky enough that you're like, I don't see how it's happening here. We also have the addition of the villainous Madame Blanche Noire, or Madam White Black in English. We've only got one issue left of this comic, so we aren't going to be spending a lot of time with Blanche, but right off the bat, I like her. I think she's fun. Generally speaking, most evil Nazi ladies in pop culture are, they're German muscle mommies or they're blonde spies. So having this one be a French traitor is actually a really nice twist. You never really see people side with the Nazis by choice in World War II stories, because, you never see it because Nazis are evil, but still, it's an interesting storytelling move, and it's different from other war comics that I've read, or movies that I've seen, or things of that nature. Blanche does fit the absolute definition of being a sexy villainess, though. Her leather top is really unzipped, and she's got big enough tracts of land to challenge either Sloane or Christy Jean. But this character is very clearly meant to be our fun stand-in for like a final boss character. We are not going to be seeing Hitler show up in this comic to torture our heroes, but we need somebody to do that. Someone needs to be the face of our bad guys, right? And that is going to be Blanche Noire. Our final issue, issue 6, doesn't open with a flashback or a flash forward like we've been used to. Instead, it opens with a fantasy. Madame Noire describes the dream of Morpheus' necklace. The world floods, the man-made island survives, and thanks to his brainwashing of the Hitler youth, the Führer has an army backing him up. In fact, Madame Noire feels bad for our cast. They came all this way only to witness the Führer extinguish the lives of 100 million people. Nick scowls at her. Why would a fellow want to go and do that? It's just mean. Sloane glares at him. He's Hitler, for God's sake. Sir Arthur doesn't believe a word of Noire's story. They're still years away from developing atomic bombs. Come on, woman. Oh, dude. Sir Arthur, thank you for backing me up on the ridiculousness of this plot element. I don't know why Lobdell would write him doing this within his own story, but still, thank you, sir. A pair of armored Nazis pull apart a curtain behind Madame Noire, revealing, yeah, that is an atomic bomb, sure. Don't believe everything that you read in the papers, Madame Noire gloats, basically continuing on to recap what she just said. I don't know why Lobdell does this, but still. Master race my petite ass, Sir Arthur says. You can't even pronounce the th sound. Solid burn, Sir Arthur. I love that. Anyways, before anything else can happen, flooping ninja stars are embedded in Madame Noire's face. Lady talk too much, Oki says. Then he draws his katana. Wait a minute. He draws his katana? They let him keep his katana? Okay, he draws his katana and then he dices a dude up. Nick uses his helmet as a bludgeon, and Sir Arthur punches another dude in the sack because he's right at sack punching level. Nick puts his helmet back on properly once the fighting is done. And it goes without saying, y'all, but they know what they have to do now. Sir Arthur and the others begin to make for the door. Absolutely, son, he says, and they'll call for backup as soon as they're clear. Yes, Oki says. Ask for lots of planes. Sloane agrees, but they're going to need an alibi for why they were here in the first place, so let's get our story straight. And pardon my language, Nick starts, but just wait one gosh darn minute. And he gives a big, honestly touching speech about how they were all willing to die for money just a minute ago. Now they are the only people in the right place to stop this plan. It's time for them to step up and do the right thing, isn't it? If not now, then when? And Sir Arthur sighs, and then he climbs onto a nearby table. Bollocks. Fine. Nick and Sloane blow this place up. You can use the explosive they passed on the way in. He and Oki will liberate the purring sun so that they can escape. But there is a problem, Nick points out. The bombs are too spread out for them to destroy them all without being caught or found out. They also don't want to blow them up because that would mean doing Hitler's final plan. You know, they don't want to do that. Nick suggests that they just blow up the man-made island. If Hitler has no island, then there's no surviving the flooding, right? Which means then you don't flood the world, right? And with that, Sir Arthur says we have a plan. Sloane then dresses in Madame Noire's uniform, I guess you would call it, and she distracts the guards who were guarding the explosives that we walked by earlier. That allows Nick to get the drop on them, and they procure the explosive-making bombs. Meanwhile, Sir Arthur and Oki retake the purring sun. Oki's comment from last issue, that the machine guns are too cold to fire, is proven true, and this is one of those things that is semi-historically accurate. I don't believe there would be the complete misuse of machine guns in this cold weather of an environment, but apparently, yeah, machine guns back in World War II were incredibly complicated, and the parts could freeze up if put in a cold enough temperature. So that's kind of a neat real-world bit of science thrown in here. Our pair of heroes are found by a guard who tries to shoot them, but nothing actually happens. Oki then separates his head from his neck. Sir Arthur hopes that his pistols, which were tucked inside his jacket, are warm enough to fire, though. And wait a minute. They didn't take Oki's katana and they didn't take Sir Arthur's guns either? Nobody patted these dudes down? And like, a katana's not exactly a subtle weapon. And I mean, our heroes are clearly on the upswing here, so even if they had taken Sir Arthur's guns, it's not like he couldn't take one off of a new corpse, but like, these are the laziest Nazis that I've ever seen in a comic book. So the two men charge at the Nazis, swinging a katana and shooting some bullets. As Sir Arthur fires on another soldier, a Nazi charges at him with his bayonet that is attached to the front of his machine gun. Spotting the trouble, Oki jumps in front of the blade and is stabbed in the back. Sir Arthur then kills the offending soldier and kneels next to a bleeding Oki. "Lad, you saved me?" Oki shushes him. He will bleed later. Bomb now. We then cut over to Sloane, who, by herself, is moving through the cathedral, dropping off the explosives. She's admiring the place as she does so, and I mean, I kind of can't blame her. The fact that this place is carved out of ice is really cool. Just think, she says. If things had been a little bit different, this place could have been all hers and Dolphy's. You know, staring down the end of the world, it's funny. Sloane thought that she would have missed him more. Maybe she's growing up. Probably not. As she places the final grouping of dynamite, we can see the massive window behind her, and in it, Nick is playing out the scene that happened at the start of issue 1 of High Roads. Sloane doesn't notice this at all, because an opened drawer on a desk catches her attention instead. Inside of it is Morpheus's necklace. Woo! Wait until she tells Nick. And an exploding plane outside finally does catch her attention, and she looks just in time to see Nick falling to his death. Acting quickly, Sloane ties a curtain around her waist, jumps out of the nearby window, and she, flooping, saves Nick. Thank you, ma'am. "Hello, soldier. Looking for a date?" she asks. And Nick is happy to see her, although he's got a hard time believing that she would do this. "You're plumb crazy, lady." "Well, people do crazy things when they're in love," Sloane says. Distracted by the almost dying, Nick agrees, "Yeah, sure they do, but wait a minute, did you say that you..." And they kiss. But the romantic moment is cut short by gunfire. Commander Key fires on the Nazis that had been heading towards them. Inside of the plane, Sir Arthur points to the nearby airstrip. They'll meet them there. Nick and Sloane untangle themselves from the curtain, he tosses the dynamite over his shoulder, and then they make the rendezvous. The purring sun flies away from the crumbling cathedral as the explosives go off, are cast safe and sound. Soon, they pass over the man-made island. It's time to drop on down the bomb. Commander Key pulls the appropriate level, but nothing happens. The bomb is stuck in the cargo bay, which is when a handful of Nazi warplanes open fire on them. Nick tells Commander Key just to keep them alive. He'll see the bomb off. But by the time Nick gets to the cargo bay, Sir Arthur is already there. He unsticks the release mechanism and then jumps on the bomb, breaking the ice that was holding it in place. As the bomb falls with Sir Arthur on it, he salutes Nick. "Goodbye and Godspeed, Nicholas. It's been one hell of a ride." Nick stretches out and he snatches Sir Arthur up by his collar. "With all due respect, sir, Cowboy Artie's got a lot more sunsets to ride off into left ahead of him." Sir Arthur is only mildly annoyed at his life being saved, because, his perfect death went wasted. But he smiles. "Thank you, lad." The bomb hits the man-made island. The cloud swallows up the planes that were firing on them. The purring sun keeps on flying. At a bunker, hidden in the dark heart of Germany again, news of the detonation is delivered to Hitler. Allied forces must have, but Hitler cuts off the news there. 9. The Allies were busy celebrating their upcoming victory. Hitler knows that it was that whore and her friends. Eva Braun assures him that things will be fine. He'll figure this out. Hitler excuses her and the colonel who delivered the news. Outside, Eva is sure that Adolf is already thinking up a new plan. And then they hear a single gunshot. An epilogue closes out the story, taking us to the then modern day in the British West Indies. There we find elderly versions of our cast who gather here every year. Commander Key has a pair of beauties on each arm, eager to hear about how he saved the world. Nick and Sloane have been married for decades. The 4 of them have been living off the money generated from selling pieces of the necklace, and Sloane thinks that Sir Arthur wants her to pawn the rest of it so that he can get his final share. An elderly Sir Arthur puffs on a pipe. "That's ridiculous," he says. "Ever since we rescued the royal princess of Madagascar, I have not so much as mentioned your silly little necklace, madam." And that's the end of Highroads. I did vaguely remember the ending to this issue. I remember that the 4 heroes survived everything and lived out the rest of their days on a tropical island, but the rest of this was all a blur. I had totally forgotten that Madame Blanche takes a bunch of shuriken to the face, and I loved her shocked expression. Penciler Leinil Yu really captured her shock and horror there. Perhaps the most shocking thing about her defeat, though, is that those shuriken really did defeat her. There's no final return, there's no villainous speech, no, last desperate attempt to stop our heroes. She just gets metal in her face, collapses to her knees, and I guess she dies because we never see her again. Which is a really sad way to go when you're the big villainous Nazi face at the end of a war comic. To be fair, it's not like Madame Noir really had time to become a notable, memorable villain in our story. She showed up just long enough to fulfill the real role that she was meant to play, which is to explain exactly what the danger posed to the world by the Morpheus necklace really is. Within that idea, there are a ton of inconsistencies with the Nazis' overall strategy. I already pointed out a few real-world logistical problems, like getting that much metal and steel to the Arctic Circle in the first place, but this ending shows just how badly these characters handled our cast anyways. The Nazis didn't disarm either Oki or Sir Arthur of their weapons, which just seems astoundingly stupid. After our heroes are captured and taken inside the Ice Palace, they aren't restrained or locked in a cell or even under a very good guard. They're not even put in handcuffs. Their wrists aren't even tied with rope or something like that. They are literally left standing in a room by themselves so that Madame Noir can gloat at them. And sure, you can give me the old classic, the villain didn't think that these characters posed a threat because they were so arrogant thing, because that is exactly what author Scott Lobdell did. Remember, Noir's whole motivation for switching sides is because she thinks that the Nazis are going to win the war. It is inevitable, so any kind of resistance is inherently stupid. But that's also really lazy writing. Lobdell could have easily cut the few pages that we got of the cast complaining about the state of the purring sun that we got earlier and added in, another dimension to Noir's capture of our heroes. We could have had the Nazis take their weapons, but then they just carried them on them and stayed in the room. There's a dude holding Oki's katana, but he's got a gun trained on Oki. That could have then led to a scene of Oki trying to signal Nick to attack these guys with his helmet, and then he'll get his katana, and then they'll fight back, which could have undercut the dramatic speechifying that Noir was doing, leaning in to the comedic tone that Highroads has had this entire time. I imagine Nick's kind of standing there next to Sloane, and he just goes, "I don't understand what Commander Key is trying to tell me," to Sloane, and she just goes, "Oh, for the love of God," and then she snatches his helmet off his head, swings it into the face of a nearby Nazi, and then tosses it back to Nick, kind of thing. Key could have used that moment to grab his katana, then he could have cut down the Nazis, and then passed some handguns over to Sir Arthur. Would that have made the comic overall a better read? I don't really know. I don't kind of think so. But it could have at least had the Nazis look semi-competent to the point of, oh, their plan to take over the world might work this time. And if they seem semi-competent, then our cast of characters seem even more competent because they beat them. Right now, the Nazis look like idiots. And our cast are the idiots who defeated the idiots. That's not exactly an impressive feat, you know? I also don't know why the Nazis didn't just, kill the cast. The good old biggest complaint about these kinds of stories where the cast is captured by a bad guy. The Nazis could have shot down their plane on their approach, or they could have shot them when they landed and found out that they weren't German allies, or they could have shot them inside the palace after Madame Noir gloated and went, "My forces are going to take over the world," and then go and just shoot them. The best explanation that I can pull out of my butt to explain why the Nazis didn't kill them was because they wanted to learn exactly who knew about Morpheus' necklace, and was there a greater force coming? Were these scouts, or are these lone figures operating on their own? But if that's the case, why didn't Madame Noir ask them any questions about what they were doing? There was no interrogation here. There was no questioning the cast at all. She overheard them talking about stealing the necklace, and then she jumped to conclusions. So I do think that this is a fairly weak part of the overall narrative. The individual moments during the post-death of Noir work really well, in my opinion. I like Nick being the one who inspires everybody to do something about the bombs and the man-made island. He has been the conscience of the group from the start, so it feels right for him to do this here. Sir Arthur then comes up with their strategy, which makes sense given his costuming. He is still dressed like a little person version of Hitler. But it does play more into his commanding take-charge attitude that he's had throughout this comic more than anything else. He is used to being the leading man, and he acts like it here. You would think that someone like Commander Key or Nick would have been the strategist of the group, as they both have a history being in their respective militaries, but Sir Arthur is actually the one who's got the cojones to see the job through. I did chuckle a little bit at Sloane dressing like Madame Noir in order to seduce the Germans. Like, come on, her regular look worked fine. Noir was literally the only woman that we saw in that entire ice palace, and if a mysterious blonde that nobody knows anything about suddenly appeared and spoke English to me, attempting to seduce me, that would set off so many alarms. But in their defense, maybe the men of the Ice Cathedral are just eager for some female companionship at this point. It's got to be cold and lonely up there. I do think that it is a cute team-up for the two characters otherwise, and I loved how Lobdell worked in almost the entirety of the first issue opening sequence with Nick, and yet didn't focus our attention on it at all. Oh, and I also got a real kick out of Sloane walking around the Ice Palace, musing about how all of this could have been hers if only Hitler didn't screw their relationship up. Like, I love her absolutely demented, in my opinion, perspective on things. That's Hitler's biggest screw-up, that he is a selfish lover, not that he's a homicidal maniac. It's within the context of a comic book, it's funny. In the real world, that would be incredibly sad. Sir Arthur and Oki's scene works well, although it does have way less emotional impact when compared to Nick and Sloane's scene. While Sir Arthur and Oki have been paired together these past two issues, it's largely been as a comedic pair, where Oki is the comedian to Arthur's straight man. This works well as a function of the story, but it doesn't really create a lot of depth between the two of them, and as such, when Oki risks his life to save Sir Arthur, there isn't much of an emotional impact there for me. Which is actually perhaps my single greatest complaint about this issue: the lack of impact it has. Despite being stabbed in the back, Oki's life is never shown or feels like it's in danger. After he gets stabbed, he and Sir Arthur leave that battlefield, they transport an atomic bomb to the Purring Sun, they save Sloane and Nick, and then all of them fly away, all before he bleeds out or before he gets any medical attention. Worse, the majority of that sequence happens off panel, which makes it feel even less important that he got stabbed, and which diminishes his overall sacrifice, and the growth that led to that sacrifice even further. Remember, Oki was not willing to die in a losing effort to try and stop America from defeating Japan. He was willing to die in order to save his friend, Sir Arthur. There is character growth here. It's extremely subtle, and I would argue I don't think there's a lot of depth to it, but there is character growth here, and having all of this bit of Oki's narrative happen off-panel undercuts that dramatically. I actually have the same feeling towards Sir Arthur's attempt to sacrifice himself when dislodging the bomb. While I do like the character growth being demonstrated by his willingness to sacrifice himself if it means saving the world, Sir Arthur has gone from someone who's doing this for the money to someone who's doing this because it's the right thing. It never felt like there was a desperate enough need for him to die here, right? It never felt like he needed to die. And Nick did save him, so clearly Sir Arthur didn't need to die, but that's what makes the stakes feel watered down overall. I do want high stakes on my high road, dang it. There is also a weird issue with the naming of the purring sun. In issue 5, when Oki refers... Actually, I've got some questions about Oki's name as well. In issue 5, when Oki refers to the plane, he calls it the purring sun, spelling it S-U-N. Here in issue 6, Nick calls it the purring sun, S-O-N. S-U-N makes more sense to me, like that feels like it's some kind of play on the rising sun that represents Japan. Sure, okay, I don't know the exact idea here, but I feel like I get the idea. But the purring S-O-N implies that the plane is either someone's child and it's purring, or that Oki is a son who is purring as its pilot. And sure, Oki is someone's son, but the purring? That's a weird way to describe yourself. I don't think I've ever heard of a dude describing himself as, I'm purring right now. And I'm sure maybe it's happened, but like, it just still seems weird and unexplained to me. Secondly, I am a little bit confused regarding Oki's name. When we are introduced to him at the end of issue 3, we're told that his name is Oki by the omniscient narrator. The narrator literally says Oki orders another drink, which means that it's author Scott Lobdell telling us this. But when Sir Arthur talks to the character, or even when the Frenchwoman introduces him, he is referred to as Commander Key. Now, I don't know enough about Japanese military ranking systems to know if he could have been a commander or not, or if that's just a friendly nickname that he has picked up in the meantime. But it has left me confused. Is his name Oki, or is it Key? I have no idea. According to some Googling that I did after the fact, there is an O prefix in Japanese that basically functions as a way of adding additional honor and or weight to someone's name. And this could explain my confusion. The character's name could actually be Key, and the O is added by the narrator to either make Key seem more honorable, for refusing his duty as a kamikaze pilot, or it could have been a derogatory, ironic nickname because he fled his duty as a kamikaze pilot. I believe that technically his name would have been read O-K-I, and it would have been pronounced more like Oki as opposed to Oki, but without the additional knowledge of the Japanese language and the aid of Google, I don't know these things, and there's nothing in the book stating that the O is an honorific. Traditionally, I think the Western media would have understood it if you had called him like Ki-sama, and we would have gone, oh, Sama is an honorific meant to indicate that he is of a higher rank than a normal person. Okay. However, that would have felt really much more like a derogatory nickname, in my opinion. We tend to associate Sama with more of like a lordship title, as opposed to just being a little bit more honorable than people around him. So this is a story detail, if it is accurate, that just goes woo right over our head. And I say this as somebody who has watched hundreds of hours of anime and has, I put in that little bit of weeb attention trying to learn Japanese, and it just never stuck at all. So again, I'm not unfamiliar with the Japanese language, but I am not fluent in the Japanese language. But apparently neither is Scott Lobdell Or at the very least, he doesn't communicate it well enough in this comic to get the point across, which is bad writing. There was also a small review I read online for High Roads that pointed out a few inaccuracies regarding Key's kamikaze story elements. First off, it stated that all Japanese kamikaze sortied from land, never from a ship, which is something that I didn't know. Secondly, the kamikaze-style attack was never carried out against churches or a church or a location like that. Instead, it was used against ships or other planes. Finally, Key leaves Japan flying on a single-engine plane, but when the cast takes off for the Arctic, the Purring Sun is now a 4-engine bomber. And maybe Key got another plane in the intervening time between his desertion and now, so that doesn't really bother me all that much. But thank you, kamikazeimages.net, for this information. I had actually thought that the commander blessing the mission in the name of God was the weird part about that scene, but it just goes to show what I do and don't know. It also demonstrates how generally uneducated we, as an audience, are regarding military history. Author Lobdell clearly didn't know these things about Japanese history, and neither did I, so I'm not saying he's an idiot. I'm just saying that we are equally uneducated, which makes us a match made in heaven for this comic. I do think that this issue, issue 6, is perhaps the weakest overall in terms of artwork, and I hate having to say that. The fine, meticulously detailed images from the past few issues are really toned down here. That's not to say that there aren't any. When Madame Noir is describing the world post-flooding, we actually get a really nicely done 2-page spread of that fantasy world. But the figures in the comic overall look a lot rougher in this issue than in the previous ones. Where the locale allowed Penciler Yu to focus more on well-rendered figure work back in issue 1, here, all of the figures are a lot looser. They all feel a little bit more animated. It feels like maybe Leinil Yu was running out of time to get this issue out. There is a great single panel of Sloane just glaring at Nick that I love, which I suspect is the end result of Yu's need for speed with this issue, because we haven't seen anything like it in the rest of the comic. Every other scene with Sloane, she looks very realistic, and in this single scene, you can see a little bit more of the simplicity and the cartooniness coming through. The lack of artistic focus is evident to me in how the story utterly failed to show me the atomic bomb being taken by our cast. On my first read-through of this comic, I actually didn't pick up on the idea that they were taking the bomb at all until I saw it go off. And it is clearly mentioned in the dialogue, but it is so casually mentioned that I missed it. And like I said earlier, there is no artwork related to Sir Arthur and Key taking that bomb down from its perch, somehow transporting it to the plane, and somehow not blowing themselves up with it. This is perhaps the single most disjointed part of this comic for me as a reader, even if I was able to put the pieces together eventually. I think that the ending of the comic, though, with the flash-forward sequence, is super cute. I love the idea of the cast getting together regularly in the years post-World War II and just going on random adventures. I honestly hoped that Lobdell would continue doing High Roads as a series of standalone sequels, like how they did for Danger Girl when the ongoing series came to an end. And each book could then be set in a different locale, going on a different adventure with a different artist. These guys saved the lost princess of Madagascar. I want to see that story. I want to know what happened. That sounds like a ton of fun. But there was never any more of High Roads. Our heroes got their happy ending, and that'll have to be enough. If only we all could be so lucky in our lives. Overall, High Roads remains a personal favorite of mine, and after the absolute train wreck that Tailweaver was, I'm very glad to say that. It is absolutely irreverent, with a good blending of humor, action, and drama. I like the overall idea that each member of the cast has failed in some way, or been wronged by the world, but it never makes them into bad people, even if it does make them into, occasionally, bad people. When put into a situation to make things better, they all do. And sure, they needed a reminder once in a while, but that's just being human. Everyone makes mistakes. Everyone deserves a little grace. Except for Nazis, who deserve to get blown up by their own atomic bomb. I also appreciate the absolutely bonkers casting of this comic. Like, sure, Nick and Sloane are both the Aryan absolutes of American society, right? They are both white, they're physically fit, they're both blonde. Hell, I think that both of them even have blue eyes. But then we've got Sir Arthur being a little person, which is a body type that you do not frequently see in the world of comic books. I can think of 3 other little people off the top of my head. We've got Eugene Judd, aka Puck, of Marvel's Alpha Flight. There was, I think his name was Jacob Marlowe, which now that I think about it, wasn't that the name of Scrooge's partner in A Christmas Story? Anyways, you've got Marlowe, who was the leader, I guess, kind of sort of in a way, of Wildstorm's Wildcats teams, at least in terms of the team's power structure. And then CrossGen's Ruse had a character named Ophelia Pressmark. So Sir Arthur is in pretty good company, actually, with that particular lineup. And of course, we got the Japanese Commander Key, we had a French person go Nazi, and then of course, we had flippin' Nazi ninjas. Nothing in High Roads is ever as simple as it first appears. Someone's physical form does not limit what they can do in the story. Someone's nationality does not inform their personal loyalty in this conflict, and even someone's job doesn't define them. The cast of High Roads are played for laughs a lot of the times, yes, but they are all well-rounded, interesting, flawed characters who nonetheless do the right thing when the time comes, and that's what I love about my heroic fiction. We all have the chance to do that. It's just a matter of making the decision to do that. Next week is actually going to be a skip week. I want a bit of lead time to get into our next series, which is going to be my final exploration of a 2000s era miniseries that I really like that probably nobody else ever read. I am also currently battling a flea infestation in our apartment, and next week's going to be the week when we're going to get it taken care of, but it means this week I've got to do the prep work for that. I have to vacuum the apartment every day and then make sure that I throw that out. So it's just, we've got one more chore thrown into everything else that I have to do, and I'm really getting worn out. After we wrap up the next series, though, I will be going into our next long-form series. But that probably isn't going to start hitting us until late February or early March. I know what book it is, I just haven't started reading it yet, and of course, we got to get through our next series as well. So, join me again in 2 weeks. We will travel to the deserts of Nesen and follow the bounty hunter named Revolver, who's got pistols built into his freaking hands. It's cool as hell, man. This book is stupid cool. When Revolver's path crosses with a little girl who is worth a bounty of $6 million, Revolver finds himself the desert's most wanted man. Join me in 2 weeks for Comic Book Breakdown episode 31.1 of Last Shot. First Draw. If you enjoyed this episode of Breakdown, please make sure to hit that like button, and if you are not subscribed to the show, then click on that as well. I love getting feedback, and I would really appreciate it if you did so. If you have any questions, concerns, or would like to suggest a comic or a series to me, Breakdown can be found on Facebook, Instagram, and on a variety of podcast platforms, with links in the description for this episode below, as well as the email cbbreakdown@gmail.com. Thank you for your time and attention.